Welcome to God, Guns, and Dogs. I'm happy you could join me. Today. I'm going to be deciphering the latest news for you today. So we have the war in Iran. First up is the U.S. and Iran. According to reporting from Axios and CNBC, there's a framework on the table that would extend the truce and keep talks moving, while Trump is insisting on conditions like open shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and no Iranian nuclear weapons. So yes, the usual, a ceasefire, a deadline, a list of demands, and enough uncertainty to keep oil traders and the cable news producers fully employed. Axios reporting said the proposed understanding would be phased, with unrestricted navigation through the Strait of Hormuz during the agreement period, and with nuclear issues and sanctions relief still part of the negotiations. CNBC's report said Trump has not yet given his final green light in the Situation Room, which is Washington's favorite place for we are absolutely serious press drama. And because nothing says stability like Middle East diplomacy moving at the speed of a breath for breaking news siren, we now shift to the part where the region catches fire again. NBC News reported that Israel continued strikes in Beirut's southern suburbs, saying the attacks followed Hezbollah's fire into Israel territory. NBC also reported that the Israeli military and Hezbollah fired projectiles toward northern Israeli towns, and the episode raised fresh concerns over the durability of the ceasefire arrangements in the region. In Beirut, the situation is deteriorating again. NBC News reported that Israel struck Hezbollah positions in the southern suburbs of Beirut after Hezbollah fired into Israel, and the Israeli military described the earlier rocket fire as a clear ceasefire violation. This is the kind of cycle that never actually settles anything. It just changes the news ticker and raises the risk level. The reporting says both sides are continuing to trade claims and retaliatory actions, which makes the entire region look like it's being run by a permanent emergency switch. And if you were hoping for a clean diplomatic reset this week, congratulations, the international calendar remains committed to chaos. Next up in the news, Mitch McConnell was hospitalized Sunday, including NPR, CNN, The Guardian, and Politico. No speculation, no armchair diagnosis, and no cheap punchlines pretending to be medical reporting. Just the fact that one of the most recognizable power brokers in modern Senate politics is once again in the middle of a health story that will keep the political class buzzing. Mitch McConnell is so old, he should have retired a long time ago. We need term limits in our Congress. People spending 40 years in Congress is ridiculous. It was supposed to be a 4-year gig, and then you move back onto the private sector. You just do something to help out your country. And you do it honestly with morals and integrity. And that's not what we're looking at here anymore, but we've got to fix it. We've got to get good people in. Then we get to the Trump lane, where the headlines are doing what Trump headlines always do, mixing policy, personality, and whatever the day's entertainment package happens to be. Axios reports that Trump won't support Pfizer renewals unless it moves alongside his Save America Act voting bill, which means surveillance policy is now part of a legislative bargaining war. On top of that, nothing gets the newsroom ticking faster than a president, a milestone, and a fresh round of commentary. This is politics in its purest form, policy at the edge. It's President Trump's 80th birthday. Happy birthday, President Trump. So for Trump's 80th birthday, it's mostly about spectacle, not mystery. And reporting from the AP and Reuters shows a big birthday era focus has been on a military parade tied to his birthday and the Army's 250th anniversary, with planning that involved thousands of troops, dozens of vehicles, helicopters, and fireworks. If you meant his current 80th birthday plans, and there's going to be a White House-style UFC event and other birthday-themed headlines. But the Army planning documents reported by AP described a potential parade on June 14th with more than 6,600 soldiers, at least 150 vehicles, 50 helicopters, 7 Army bands, and a fireworks finale. Reuters said the cost could run from about $25 million to $45 million, and the parade was being discussed as part of the Army's 250th anniversary event, also lined up with Trump's birthday. Reuters put the cost in the tens of millions of dollars, which is a very expensive way to say happy birthday. All right, folks, please like and subscribe. Don't forget, it helps the algorithm and it gets the message out there so more people can get involved or just listen to another constituent or another American citizen and talking about what's going on today in the news. So let's talk about two things that keep popping up in the headlines: political arguments and, honestly, a lot of confusion, and what the Supreme Court is actually doing right now in the ongoing claims and investigations around voter fraud in California. Because if you've been following the news even casually, you've probably heard a lot of strong opinions, but not always a lot of clear explanation. So tonight, we're going to slow this down, separate fact from narrative, and walk through what's really going on. Let's start with the Supreme Court, shall we? The Supreme Court, as you know, folks, is the highest court in the United States, and it doesn't just rule on criminal cases or settle disputes. It interprets the Constitution. That means when a case reaches the court, the question is often not just what happened, but what does the law and the Constitution actually mean? And right now, the court is in one of the most consequential periods in decades. We've seen major rulings in recent years on abortion, administrative power, environmental regulations, and student loans, and of course, a bunch more. But what's happening now is a continuation of a broader shift, a rebalancing of power between federal agencies, Congress, and the courts themselves. One of the key themes in recent Supreme Court activity is skepticism towards what's called the administrative state. That sounds technical, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Federal agencies like the EPA, the FDA, the Department of Education have long had authority to interpret the laws passed by Congress and create regulations. For decades, courts generally deferred to these agencies under a principle known as the Chevron deference. In simple terms, Chevron deference meant if a law is ambiguous and a federal agency gives a reasonable interpretation, courts usually go along with the decision. But the current Supreme Court has been chipping away at that idea. Why does that matter? Because it shifts power away from unelected agency officials back towards either Congress or the courts. Supporters say this restores constitutional balance. Critics say it makes it harder for the government to respond quickly to complex problems like climate change, hoax, public health, or financial regulation. So when you hear that the Supreme Court is taking on cases involving agencies, regulations, or executive power, that's part of a bigger pattern. And another major area is election law. The court has been increasingly involved in disputes over voting rules, redistricting, and election procedures. These cases often revolve around questions like who gets to set the rules for elections, states, Congress, or the courts? What counts as fair districting versus partisan gerrymandering? And how far can states go in regulating voting access? And that brings us directly into the second part of this conversation, voter fraud claims specifically in California. Now, California is often at the center of national political debate, not just because of its size, but because of its voting system. California uses a system called universal mail-in voting. Every registered voter is sent a ballot. You can mail it back, drop it off, or vote in person. And you can use one address for 5,000 people and get a universal ballot mailed every year to that address. 5,000 of them. You can even sign with a smiley face. Supporters argue that this increases participation and makes voting more accessible. Yeah, for fraud. Critics argue it creates opportunity for fraud, coercion, and administrative error. So what's really happening, folks? First, it's important to distinguish between allegations, investigations, and proven cases. There have been instances of voter fraud in California, but they are typically small in scale and often involve individual misconduct rather than systemic manipulation, which is what's happening now. This is huge. For example, there have been cases where individuals submitted ballots on behalf of others improperly. Campaign workers were accused of mishandling ballots. People attempted to vote more than once or voted on behalf of someone else. These cases do happen and they are investigated and in many instances prosecuted. But here's the key point. Proving widespread coordinated voter fraud on a large scale enough to affect statewide or national election outcomes is a much higher bar. And so far, across multiple elections, including highly scrutinized ones, there has been no conclusive evidence of large-scale fraud in California. that would change election results. But we did all watch with our own very eyes till they just keep counting the mail-in votes until the Democrat wins. That's how they've been doing it. They've been getting early votes and bags and bags and bags of ballots for homeless people or people that, lived at a rental property 15 years ago, and they're getting all these ballots for those people. They're filling them out. They're keeping them on the side. And then Nithya Raman turned them in on the first tranche of voter ballots, and that's why nobody got any votes but her. And then she jumped in a second, which is fraudulent. That doesn't mean the system is perfect. Their system is so broken, it's not even funny. It means the difference between vulnerability and exploitation is critical. And voting systems have vulnerabilities. The question is whether those vulnerabilities are being used in a way that significantly alters outcomes. California has implemented several safeguards to address these concerns. No, they haven't. Signature verification on mail ballots. You can sign with an X or a smiley face. But 38,000 of Spencer Pratt's votes got sent back for signature verification. Only his, though. And Nithya Raman, she registered 43,000 homeless people to vote and got a $600,000 check. Look, and guess how many votes she's ahead? 43,000. Wow, coincidences are cool, aren't they? Ballot tracking system so voters can see when their ballot is received and counted. You mean returned for no reason at all. Chain of custody rules for handling ballots. Criminal penalties for fraud or interference. We wish. But critics argue that these safeguards are not always consistently enforced, especially given the scale of California's fraudulent elections. And that's where a lot of political tension comes in. Some people look at the existence of any fraud cases and say, see, the system is broken. Others look at the scale and say these are isolated incidents, not evidence of systemic failure. Both perspectives are reacting to real things, interpreting them very differently. Now, how does the Supreme Court tie into all of this, you ask? The court doesn't directly oversee elections, but it does rule on the legal frameworks that govern them. For example, if a state passes a law tightening voter ID requirements, expanding mail voting, or changing how ballots are counted, those laws can be challenged in court. Eventually, some of those challenges make their way to the Supreme Court, and when they do, the court's decisions can reshape election rules nationwide. One of the ongoing debates is how much authority states should have on their own elections. The Constitution gives states primary responsibility for running elections, but Congress also has the power to regulate federal elections. And courts step in when there are disputes about whether laws violate constitutional protections like equal protection or voting rights. So when you hear about Supreme Court cases involving elections, they're often about where those boundaries are and should be. And another concept that occasionally comes up is the independent state legislature theory. This idea suggests that the state legislatures have broad authority to set election rules, potentially with limited oversight from state courts. The Supreme Court has addressed versions of this theory, and while it hasn't fully embraced the most expansive interpretation, it has left the door open for continued debate. And why does this matter? Because it affects who has the final say in how elections are conducted. Is it state legislatures, state courts, federal courts, or some combination of all three? These are not abstract questions. They directly impact policies like mail-in voting, ballot deadlines, and district maps. Now, let's bring it back to California specifically. California is often used as an example in national debates because it represents a more expansive approach to voting access. Universal mail-in ballots, same-day voter registration, ballot harvesting, which allows third parties to collect and submit ballots on behalf of another person. This last one, the ballot harvesting, is particularly controversial. Supporters say it helps elderly, disabled, or busy voters participate. Critics say it introduces opportunities for manipulation and undue influence. There have been allegations and investigations relating to ballot harvesting practices, but again, the scale and impact are heavily debated. Some cases have resulted in charges or penalties, especially at local levels. But claims of widespread abuse affecting statewide outcomes remains unproven. And this is where things get complicated in public discourse, folks, because election integrity is one of those issues where trust matters just as much as technical accuracy. Even if a system is statistically secure, if a large portion of the public doesn't trust it, That creates a different kind of problem, folks. And at the same time, making claims of widespread fraud without strong evidence can also undermine trust. So you end up with the feedback loop. Concerns lead to claims, claims lead to investigations, investigations sometimes find small issues, which are then used to reinforce broader claims, and the cycle continues on and on. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court is operating at a level above all of this, deciding how laws are interpreted, not directly investigating fraud or running elections. So when people connect the court to voter fraud claims, they often are making two related but distinct things: the legal framework for elections and integrity of how those elections are carried out. Both matter, but they're not the same. If you're trying to understand what's really going on, it helps to keep that distinction clear. Now, let's talk about incentives for a second. Because whenever you're analyzing something like voter fraud claims, it's worth asking, who benefits from emphasizing this issue? Who benefits from downplaying it? Political parties, candidates, advocacy groups, and media outlets all have incentives. Some emphasize fraud concerns to argue for stricter voting laws. Others emphasize access and downplay fraud risks to argue against those restrictions. But that doesn't automatically make either side wrong, but it does mean you should look closely at the evidence that's being presented to you. And this is where things can get very frustrating, folks, because election systems are very complex. Data is often incomplete or interpreted differently, and investigations take time. So instead of clear answers, you get competing narratives. One side says the system is secure and fraud is rare, and the other side said the system is vulnerable and we're not catching everything. Those statements are not necessarily mutually exclusive either. A system can be both generally secure and still have vulnerabilities. The real question is scale and impact. Is fraud happening at a level that changes election outcomes is the question. Or is it happening at a level that is statistically insignificant but still worth addressing? That's the question the policymakers, courts, and investigators are constantly grappling with. And it's not an easy one to answer definitively. As for the Supreme Court, what you should be watching isn't whether it's cracking down on fraud directly, it's how it rules on cases that shape election laws. Pay attention to the decisions involving voting access and restrictions, redistricting and gerrymandering, and the balance of power between states and the federal government, administrative authority, because those rulings will determine the rules of the voting game. And the rules of the game ultimately influence how elections are conducted, how disputes are resolved, and how confident people feel in the wake of those results. So if you're trying to make sense of all the grounded takeaway, the Supreme Court is reshaping legal frameworks, especially around government authority and election law. California's voting system is expansive and has faced allegations and isolated cases of fraud, but large-scale outcome-changing fraud hasn't been conclusively demonstrated. The debate is as much about trust and perception as it is about evidence. And the intersection of these issues, law, policy, and public confidence, is where most of the tension lives. If you're watching this unfold, don't just follow the headlines. Look at the rulings, look at the verified cases, and look at how policies actually function in practice, because the reality is more nuanced than the loudest voices on either side will usually admit. And in a topic like this, nuance matters. So our elections have to be fixed. We all watched it happen in real time. We watched that California election was a joke, total joke. That we can never let happen again. We've got to secure our election, and we've got to get good, honest people in Congress. Graham Plattner, are you serious? A woman beater, another one? I mean, come on. Susan Collins has got to win. You guys, Democrats, you might as well just hang it up and start finding some good, honest, normal people, because all the freaks that you're bringing in is just pushing everybody away even further. You guys, I hope you can like and subscribe this video. I hope it brings you some value and you got a little bit of insight about our elections and how corrupt they are and how they have to be changed. Remember now, no matter what life throws your way, you still have potential. God bless you, and God bless America.